Thank you all. Thank you for your hospitality. Thank you for welcoming me here. Especially thanks to Rosemary, who's been so nice to me and is a good friend. I don't know, some of you might be surprised to see a guy who's 2/3 of the way to being a dead white male standing up here and talking about Buffalo Soldiers. If you are, maybe you'll be comforted to know that along the way, I've had my perceptions and expectations challenged by reality a number of times too. I want to tell you a story about meeting Maxine Gordon, who is the widow of Dexter Gordon, who some of you might know is a renowned jazz saxophonist and the star of a movie called Around Midnight. Dexter Gordon's grandfather was Edward Baker, who was a sergeant major of the 10th Cavalry and received a Medal of Honor for bravery at San Juan Hill on July 1, 1898. Maxine found me, just like Rosemary found me, genealogists doing their research. They find me in my books, and she contacted me through my publisher, and I was so delighted to hear from her. I invited her to come out to have dinner with me and Irene when she came to Washington to do her research from New York. Meet her at the nearest metro stop. So I told her I'd meet her there at 6:30. I get there, and the escalator pulses up commuters every 3 to 5 minutes, kind of with the Judas commuter in the front, and all these guys being launched back out into the suburbs. I got there at 6:30. Commuters kept coming up. I waited. It got to be 7 o'clock. I don't see this woman. I wait. Finally, it's past 7. I see no one who looked like she might be Dexter Gordon's widow. But there's this little red-headed lady over here holding one long-stemmed white flower, and I walk up to her and say, "Are you Maxine Gordon?" She says, "Are you Mickey Schubert?" And she was looking for a black man, and I was looking for a black woman. And neither one of us was right. And the point of the story is, sometimes we draw conclusions based on assumptions without evidence. And this is true of our view of the past as well as our own world. And as I go through this presentation on Buffalo Soldiers, try to keep that in mind, because some of the content of this talk addresses the very theme. Do you hear me over there? Oh, that's very cool. Now, the saga of the Buffalo Soldiers, black soldiers in the U.S. Army between the American Civil War of 1861-65 and World War I, is a mainstream story. It's not just black history, it's not just frontier history, it's American history. And it even, as we now know, touched places like Vermont. As maybe all of you know, in July 1909, 10th Cavalry troops, known to us today as Buffalo Soldiers, marched into Vermont to occupy Fort Ethan Allen in Colchester. Among them were men whose descendants are still here with us here in Vermont, the offspring of soldiers like Silas Johnson, John Lyons, George Osborne, and Beverly Thornton. Now, before their arrival, they'd been stationed out west from Kansas to Arizona, Nebraska to Montana, as well as in Cuba and in the Philippines. Like white soldiers of their time, they had participated in central episodes of the American experience. They fought in wars that have become the stuff of movies and legends, and they represented a significant portion of a huge public investment in the development of the Western American vastness. They also fought in 2 foreign wars at the turn of the century, in Cuba against Spain and in the Philippines against a native independence movement, and participated in General John Pershing's punitive expedition into Mexico. Between the Civil War and World War I, 23 of them received the Medal of Honor. Now, these soldiers made up about 12% of a really small army, and they participated in about 13% of that army's Indian engagements. Of course, they did more than fight their share of battles. Like other soldiers, they did the things that were essential to Western settlement. They made maps, they blazed trails, they improved roads, guarded settlements, roads, and stage stations, and they provided the reassuring military presence that helped encourage development. Yet, for all they did, they formed only a small fraction of a tiny army. All told, according to William Doback and Thomas Phillips, in their book, The Black Regulars, we're talking about fewer than 20,000 men in 4 regiments between 1866 and 1898. Now, the central long-term significance of these soldiers had to do with inclusion. Inclusion for the first time of black men in the regular Army of the United States, and inclusion regarding black participation in mainstream American processes. During the American Civil War of 1861-65, nearly 200,000 black men served in the army that defeated the Confederate Rebellion. 35,000 or so of these men died, mainly by disease, but that was the same among white troops. Disease killed many more soldiers on both sides than enemy bullets in the Civil War. Blacks in the Civil War Army all served as volunteers, recruited for specific terms of wartime service, and not as regulars, in an army that expanded dramatically for the war and contracted just as dramatically afterward to about 25,000. More than 2 million men, white and black, served, and over 1 million remained under arms at the end of the war. Think about it, 1 million men. This was a big army, especially when we consider that the United States had a population of about 20 million. Now, the acceptance of black volunteers for military service was itself a revolutionary act. Frederick Douglass, we all know Frederick Douglass. He was the most famous black abolitionist and maybe the most famous of all abolitionists, white or black, clearly understood the revolutionary significance of accepting blacks into the army. Douglass, who was a brilliant writer and orator, wrote in what is one of his most frequently quoted statements, "Once let the black man get upon his person the brass letters U.S. Let him get an eagle on his button and a musket on his shoulder, bullets in his pockets, and there is no power on earth which can deny that he has earned the right to citizenship in the United States." Now, after the war, the contribution of the large number of black volunteers to the Union victory left its mark. When the Army was reduced and reorganized in 1866, blacks had a place among the regulars for the first time, and the revolution anticipated by Frederick Douglass took another step forward. This first inclusion of black men in the regular Army tacitly recognized the contributions black soldiers had made to preserving the Union. Didn't seem like a big step. 2 infantry regiments, the 24th and the 25th, out of 25. 2 cavalry regiments, the 9th and the 10th, out of 10. But it was a step, a reward that recognized an undeniably large contribution to the nation's survival. Now, you know, the past is strange territory. It's fraught with ambiguity, and the inclusion of blacks in the regular Army had its share. Now, first of all, a place was made only for enlisted soldiers, privates, corporals, sergeants, no officers. They were not prohibited, the subject just didn't come up. Over the 50 years between the Civil War and World War I, exactly 5 black men made their way into the ranks of commissioned regular Army officers. They included 3 West Point graduates, Henry Flipper, who was the first, John Alexander, and Charles Young. And also 2 former enlisted men, Benjamin O. Davis, he's the one who circled in this picture of 9th Cavalry officers at Fort D.A. Russell, Wyoming, and John E. Green. Moreover, the creation of this segregated place for black soldiers anticipated by a generation the spread of segregation as the mode of race relations imposed by whites in the South, what we usually call Jim Crow. And foreshadowed by 2 generations, the formal segregation of civilian employment in the federal government by President Woodrow Wilson. So while inclusion in the Army was a step toward equality, setting precedents for segregation was not, segregation being definitely inherently unequal. Now, but the positive change outweighed the negative. And here we get back to the original question of why the participation of so few black soldiers in so small an army is important. The spread of the United States across the continent is one of the central acts of the American national drama. One of the processes that Americans consider defining, unquestionably a mainstream development, and these soldiers were participants. This is the most important message of the Buffalo Soldier. Despite obstacles placed in the way of black progress, despite racism and discrimination, blacks participated in the frontier drama. There's nothing more important about their presence in the Army, nothing that they did, no battles in which they fought than that. They were there and they participated. And they did participate in significant battles. They fought in some major wars against Indians, from the conflicts against the Cheyenne in Kansas just after the Civil War to the last major campaign on the Pine Ridge in South Dakota in 1890, 1891. Depending on which of three overlapping listings of combat engagements you choose, between 1866 and 97, they fought in between 135 and 163 of 939 to 1,296 battles and skirmishes. Not enough to justify claims that they bore the brunt of frontier warfare, but sufficient to show their active participation in more than 30 years of sometimes bloody and severe combat. Most notably, they were at the center of the brutal campaign against the Apaches Victorio and Nana in 1879-1881. Corporal Edward Scott of the 10th Cavalry lost his leg in the fighting against Geronimo in 1886. Depending on which of the three overlapping listings of combat engagements you choose, both cavalry regiments, the 9th and the 10th, played prominent roles in the Apache Wars, suffering more casualties in those campaigns than they did in all the other frontier campaigns combined. 37 of the 61 Buffalo soldiers killed in Indian fighting during the period of 1867-1890 fell against the Apaches. 8 of the 18 Medal of Honor recipients earned their recognition for conspicuous bravery in this bitterest of American frontier wars. The man in the circle is First Sergeant George Jordan of the 9th Cavalry, who received a Medal of Honor against the Apaches. The man second from the right on the top, Sergeant Thomas Shaw, is another one who received the Medal of Honor against the Apaches. Little subliminal advertising for a book that has the story of all 23 of the Buffalo Soldier Medal of Honor heroes. Not so subliminal, but, you know, it's a slideshow. Okay. Sergeant Emmanuel Stantz of the 9th Cavalry was the first of the Medal of Honor recipients, and the award of the medal to Stantz in 1870, just 4 years after the regiment was organized, shows just how far the 9th had come in a short time. It was developing into a worthy outfit with sergeants who could lead and earn recognition as heroes, soldiers who would obey and provide the support such leaders could depend on. Before the century ended, black regulars fought in Cuba against Spain in 1898, where 5 more received the nation's highest award, and then in the ensuing guerrilla war in the Philippines and in Mexican border skirmishes. Dennis Bell, George Wanton both served in the 10th Cavalry in Cuba and received medals of honor for their bravery. Soldiers in the Philippines. Although their mission and their contribution mirrored the work of white soldiers during the same period, black soldiers served under dramatically different circumstances. The facts of prejudice and bigotry gave their story a singular quality. They regularly faced hostility from the very people that they protected. The pioneers who went west and populated the communities in the new states and territories. The worst time and place was probably Texas in the years after the Civil War, where the Wild West met the unreconstructed South. Philip Sheridan's wisecrack, uttered in the late 1860s, that had he owned hell in Texas, he would live in hell and rent out Texas, probably would have resonated among the black soldiers who later served there. Also, given the lack of civilian opportunity, they tended to desert less and stay in the Army longer. Thus, they tended, more than white soldiers, to be married and to have children. Sergeant Madison Ingeman's photograph with his daughter Laura, you can see, maybe because the University of Vermont did not bless us with anything approximating precision in the videos here, in the images, you can see across his chest written the word Papa. That obviously she'd annotated, or one of his kids had annotated this picture in later years. Well, what did the Buffalo Soldiers themselves think about the Indians, about their lives on the frontier, about their role in taming it? Some few of them wrote down their thoughts, leaving them in affidavits buried in pension files, or putting them in letters to the magazine Winners of the West. This is what Winners of the West looked like in the 1920s and 1930s. Henry Bush, a cook in civilian life and a native of Ontario, Canada, never forgot the Apache Wars. He served in C of the 9th Cavalry from 1878 to 1883. Two of his comrades, Thomas Boyne and John Denny, this man, received the Medal of Honor. In 1915, Henry Bush wrote down his recollections of the Apache campaign. He emphasized continuous, quote, scouting service, which subjected us to great exposure, such as sleeping in rains and snows in the mountains unprotected from the elements. Sometimes no sleep for 2 days, sometimes subsisting on the most meager diet, sometimes marches of 90 miles across the prairies of New Mexico and Texas in a hot, scorching sun, sometimes marching through blinding sandstorms and beating rain. Milton Ross of the 10th Cavalry also served against the Apaches. In the Army for 10 years, between 1879 and 89, he chased Geronimo through the mountains with D Troop. And the campaigning was very hard. Many times, he wrote, we were without water for 2 or 3 days, eating our hardtack and fat bacon. Charles Creek, also of the 9th Cavalry, didn't dwell on the brutal heat of the Southwest. He remembered the Pine Ridge country in winter. Tired, he told historian Don Rickey, of looking mules in the face from sunrise to sunset, he joined the Army. His adventurous spirit was rewarded with a frigid winter under canvas. How cold was it? Quote, you ate out in the cold like a dog, often not in the tent because the Indian's going to sneak up on you, unquote. It was so cold the spit froze when it left your mouth. Corporal Joseph Sheaf of the 9th G Troop was there too. He remembered 24-hour guard duty without shelter and a blizzard in which we suffered untold agony. Corporal Scott Lovelace of the 10th Cavalry remembered the cold too, but on the southern plains. Lovelace spent 5 years, from 1876 to 81, at some of the Army's garden spots, guarding Kiowa prisoners at Fort Sill in Indian Territory, chasing Apaches from Forts Richardson and Stockton in Texas. I have, he reminisced in 1926, slept many a night on the cold frozen ground, covered with 5 foot of snow without an overcoat, blanket, or shelter tent, with half rations, chasing the Redskins to help blaze a right-of-way for the settlers of the Wild West. It was no wonder he retired in Jacksonville, Florida. Benjamin Ratliff, a veteran of the 25th Infantry, recalled the cold and the heat. He remembered the Indians, too. I was engaged in guarding and protecting the mail station, and I was out here and there and yonder in the seething hot days of summer as well as the severe cold of winter, often in momentary danger of attack by the savages. Arthur Winston, who served in the 10th Cavalry during the Apache Wars, shared Ratliff's low opinion of the foe he called them murderous Indian bands. William Dooley remembered the Indians too. The veteran of the 38th Infantry claimed that he saw many Indians while in service and scalped quite a number. Now, Reuben Waller, that's Reuben Waller, one of the original members of the 10th Cavalry, had a similar recollection. A former slave who'd begun his military career as a servant to a Confederate general during the Civil War, Waller fought against the Cheyenne at the Battle of Beaver Creek, Kansas, where H and I troops protected General Eugene Carr and his escort from Fort Wallace. Quote, our soldiers scalped some of the Indians, but we soon put a stop to that kind of barbarity among the 10th Cavalrymen, unquote. Waller later wrote, Waller was also at Beecher Island in the Republican River in September 1868, where his troop saved Major George Forsyth and his 50 scouts who were trapped and surrounded by Cheyenne warriors. History, he boasted at the 60th anniversary of the fair in 1928 shows that Colonel Carpenter and his colored orderly were the first to rescue the men, and the colored orderly was me, unquote. Now, unlike Waller, George W. Ford never claimed to have lifted a scalp. He was born a free man, grandson of West Ford, who'd been overseer of the house servants at George Washington's Mount Vernon estate in Virginia. He was also an original member of the 10th Cavalry. Ford served as a major in the 23rd Kansas in the Spanish-American War. He volunteered for World War I, and he died just 2 months before Germany invaded Poland in September of 1939, the last original member of the 10th Cavalry to pass away. He never forgot duty as a mail carrier between Forts Arbuckle and Gibson, Indian Territory, during the winter of 1868. This was no pleasure ride, he wrote, when one considers that beside fording the icy waters of the Canadian, the Washita, and the Wild Horse, there was also the danger of capture by Indians, unquote. Were they proud of what they did? I think so. Henry McCombs, an early member of the 10th Cavalry, probably spoke for many of his comrades when he said, quote, "We made the West, defeated the hostile tribes of Indians, and made the country safe to live in," unquote. Richard Miller of the 9th Cavalry, who served in 1886 to 91, certainly seemed proud of his role. Quote, "We gladly did all we could to smooth the way for our great West," unquote. And he relished memories of the strenuous and also the happy life we led in our younger days in the Army. Now, we reached a major turning point in awareness of the participation of black soldiers in the westward movement in the 1960s, in the period of the Civil Rights Movement. The process started in the late 50s, first with Dudley Taylor Cornish's book about black soldiers in the Civil War, called The Sable Arm, which appeared just in time for the Civil War centennial, and then continued with John Ford's Sergeant Rutledge, a 1960 film of subtlety and insight about a black sergeant accused of rape and murder. The 1960s saw a great rise in civil rights activities, protests, counter-demonstrations, violent white resistance to change, and pivotal legislation, and ultimately interest in black history and new academic programs in black studies. It was in this context that William Leckey's book, The Buffalo Soldiers, a narrative of the Negro cavalry in the West, appeared in 1967. And a song, The Buffalo Soldiers, recorded by two rhythm and blues groups, the Flamingos and the Persuasions, recalled the soldiers' heroics on the frontier and in the war against Spain in 1898, and asked plaintively of the Buffalo Soldiers, "Will you survive in this new land?" Buffalo Soldiers began to enter the mainstream of American consciousness then, in the 1960s. Now, 30 years later, by the end of the 90s, the Buffalo Soldier was a well-known, widely familiar cultural icon. There were more than 300 books and articles, t-shirts, refrigerator magnets, phone cards, jigsaw puzzles, coffee mugs, postage stamp, even a necktie. Buffalo Soldiers became the subject of romance novels, children's books, plays, bad movies, and popular songs. By the turn of the 21st century, there were also statues at 5 western forts: Huachuca, Leavenworth, Baird in New Mexico, Selden in New Mexico, Fort Bliss, Texas, and a 6th dedicated at Old Fort D.A. Russell, now Francis E. Warren Air Force Base, in 2007. General Colin Powell was instrumental in promoting this knowledge. At Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, on July 25, 1992, he dedicated a larger-than-life statue of a mounted trooper by sculptor Eddie Dixon. Powell, a black 4-star Army general, served as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the military advisor to the President of the United States between 1989 and 1993. He was deeply interested in the history of black participation in the armed forces, and he considered himself, quote, "the descendant of those Buffalo Soldiers and all the black men and women who served the nation in uniform," unquote. when he spoke at that dedication in 1992 to an audience in which black veterans of the segregated army and uniformed Buffalo Soldier reenactors were clearly visible, national television networks carried the ceremony. Powell reminded the nation of the tradition of black military service. Quote, "From the beginning of our nation," he said, "African Americans answered the call to arms in defense of America whenever the call came. Moreover, from the establishment of the regiments of black regulars after the Civil War," quote, "African Americans would henceforth always be in uniform, challenging the conscience of the nation, posing the question, how could they be allowed to defend the cause of freedom, to defend the nation, if they themselves were to be denied the benefits of being American?" He acknowledged that he, the highest ranking officer in the armed forces, owed a debt to the black soldiers who'd gone before him. And he challenged young people not to forget the sacrifices of the soldiers and their service. The well-publicized ceremony, the declaration by both houses of Congress that July 28, 1992 was Buffalo Soldier Day, and an imposing permanent presence of the statue itself unleashed what historian James Leiker called a veritable explosion of Buffalo Soldier commemorations, including museum displays, documentaries, newspaper and journal articles, and reenactment societies. The anonymity of the Buffalo Soldier in the United States really ended in the summer of 1992. With wider knowledge of the Buffalo Soldier came the beginnings of a Buffalo Soldier myth. Leckie, who was my dissertation advisor at Toledo, popularized the term Buffalo Soldiers, claiming that the Indians gave the name to the black soldiers of the 10th Cavalry because they saw some resemblance between these brown-skinned men, some of whom had woolly-looking hair, and who sometimes wore buffalo hide coats in the winter, and the buffalo that were so important to the Plains Indians tribes, cultures. Leckie went from there to assert that the name might have reflected the Indians' respect for the soldiers because the buffalo was so important to their culture, and they would not have made the comparison if it had not been a respectful one. In a footnote, he wrote, "The origin of the term Buffalo Soldiers is uncertain, although the common explanation is that the Indians saw a similarity between the hair of the Negro soldier and that of the buffalo. The buffalo was a sacred animal to the Indian, and it's unlikely that he would so name an enemy if respect were lacking. It's a fair guess," Leckie went on, "that the Negro troopers understood this, and thus his willingness to accept the title." Now, over the years since Leckie offered this cautious explanation, we've moved to the point where many people regard the nickname Buffalo Soldier as an honorific that shows that the Indians considered the black troopers to be exceptional, perhaps the best soldiers that the Army had. This notion that the Buffalo Soldier represented the Army's best, embellished as time went on to include the assertion that they fought in a disproportionately large number of Indian battles, has taken hold in the society at large. The Walmart website, in its celebration of Black History Month in 2005, had a so-called study guide which said their name, Buffalo Soldiers, was bestowed on them by the Cheyenne people. It refers to their fierce fighting abilities along with the woolly texture of their hair. Honestly, however, we have to say that we lack any proof that the name meant anything more than an identification between brown skin and nappy hair on one side and brown fur on the other. And we have no evidence that the soldiers themselves used the name to refer to themselves, not in black newspapers, not in pension files, not in letters, not anywhere. The 10th Cavalry's crest does prominently display a bison, but it was designed and adopted in 1911 during the time that the 10th was here at Fort D.A. Russell. So it does not necessarily reflect acceptance of the name by Buffalo soldiers of the Indian War period. Now, the most serious challenge to the emerging myth of the Buffalo soldier came from Indians themselves, who were especially angered over the publicity that attended the issue of a Buffalo soldier postage stamp in 1994. And they resented the suggestion that there was some special bond between the soldiers and their warrior ancestors. The first salvo of dissent came from Vernon Bellecourt of the American Indian Movement. Writing in Indian Country Today, a reliable forum for objections to glorification of Buffalo soldiers, Bellecourt denied that the name reflected any, quote, endearment or respect, unquote. As far as he was concerned, Plains Indians only applied the term Buffalo soldiers to, quote, these marauding, murderous cavalry units, unquote, because of their dark skin and the texture of their hair. Outbursts continued through the 1990s, as did demonstrations at public observances and museum exhibits on Buffalo soldier history. A student protest at San Francisco State University over the stamp threatened to set fire to mailboxes, and apparently succeeded in ending the sale of the stamp at the campus post office. So just as the Leavenworth statue catalyzed public awareness of the Buffalo soldier, the stamp provoked substantial Indian resentment of the favorable publicity given to the troopers, what you might call a backlash. Now, the Indian anger surprised and shocked those who thought that the mere fact of non-whiteness, now as well as during the frontier period, should constitute the prima facie basis for an alliance or common cause among peoples of color against a white oppressor. Now, this is a conventional Rainbow Coalition expectation in the United States these days, and the advertising copy in Wild West magazine, August 2001, for a new painting by Don Stivers, one of the most prolific depictors of Buffalo soldiers. I don't like his work, so I don't show his pictures. Tried to encompass it all, acknowledging that the soldiers and warriors were enemies, but asserting that they were fighting for the same thing. So, quote, there seemed an unspoken bond between these two groups of Americans that forged a mutual respect and helped them understand the ferocity with which each fought, unquote. Now, of course, an unspoken bond is really easy to assert, but it's conveniently impossible to prove. The expectation that there was a bond, unspoken or otherwise, between the soldiers and the Indians just does not fit this strange past of ours. And as we see from the Indian annoyance with the publicity given to Buffalo soldiers, it doesn't always fit our contentious present either. As far as the Buffalo soldiers were concerned, it can't be overemphasized that the soldiers spoke English. They were Anglophones. They also came from a monotheistic agrarian industrial culture. The Indians, on the other hand, were semi-nomadic warrior hunters. They spoke many languages, none of them English, and their religious practices, shamanism, supernatural visions, self-mutilation, even among some tribes, human sacrifice, were unfamiliar, even repellent to the soldiers. The black soldiers' reactions to the Indians mirrored the prevailing racism. Black soldiers used the same dismissive epithets, hostile tribes, naked savages, and redskins. They also indulged in the same racist caricatures employed by whites. Reminiscent of the use among whites of blackface to denigrate and stereotype African Americans, a black private named Robinson went to a masquerade ball at Fort Baird, New Mexico in 1894, mockingly dressed, according to a published report by a soldier, as, quote, an idiotic Indian squaw, unquote. Now, the response of black soldiers to Indians should be interpreted with care. Black soldiers in the generation after slavery longed for inclusion in the society at large. That society was racist, and soldier use of bigoted terms and stereotypes may show no more than their acquiescence in the larger cultural order. a phenomenon that Joel Covell called meta-racism. So, when a black soldier called a Plains Indian in 1890 a voodoo nigger, he not only repeated the voice of a white soldier who called the Plains Indians in 1873 red niggers, he also reflected the overall values of the culture in which he struggled for a place. By such usages, he might have hoped to ally himself with the dominant group. And many former slaves were eager to validate their claims on citizenship by wearing the uniform of the United States Army. Very few looked across the cultural gap between them and the semi-nomadic warrior hunters against whom they fought and saw any similarity in their respective conditions. Culture created a gap that was virtually unbridgeable. This fundamental opposition may be frustrating, even seem incomprehensible to people seeking to impose a rainbow coalition frame of reference on the past, but it existed all the same. As historian Bill Gwaltney, a descendant of Buffalo soldiers, said, "Buffalo soldiers fought for recognition as citizens in a racist country, and American Indian peoples fought to hold on to their traditions, their land, and their lives. These were not compatible, harmonious goals that could provide the basis for coalition building." Even today, the huge gap between the soldiers and the warrior tribes of the West sometimes influences perceptions. You know, I once spent 3 days trying to explain to a busload of vacationers on a Buffalo Soldier tour, that's me on a Buffalo Soldier tour, that the past was strange territory, that history didn't always validate current views, and that Buffalo soldiers and Indians did not achieve some empathy based on color. I cited the writings of Kenneth Porter, who was a pioneer in the study of relations between Texas tribes and blacks. I quoted the Buffalo soldiers themselves, like I've done this evening, who used these same dismissive epithets that were employed by whites. I still didn't get through to them all. Notably, this young black reporter from Baltimore wore a pith helmet, he had John Lennon shades, and he persisted in the view that soldiers and warriors must have seen some commonality in their condition. Well, enlightenment came on the 4th day out. We were on the Pine Ridge Reservation in Shannon County, South Dakota. This is the poorest county in the United States in most censuses. And we were heading for Drexel Mission, in the site of a battle in which William Wilson of the 9th Cavalry earned a Medal of Honor. Now, on the way, we made the obligatory stop at Wounded Knee Creek to see the site of the massacre and visit the cemetery. You know, there's no more dramatic illustration of the tragedy of Indian life than that burial ground on that windswept hill. Once you see the mass, there you see that mass grave, about 150 victims of the 7th Cavalry, but there are also the 20th century graves, those of the children, because life expectancy is real short on the Pine Ridge, and those of the soldiers killed on hills in Korea or in paddies in Vietnam, who, just like black soldiers of an earlier generation, probably hoped that military service would validate their claim on citizenship. Now, at the base of that hill, on which sits the Wounded Knee Cemetery, a Sioux woman stopped her car, and she asked my journalist friend, who was walking with my wife, that's how I know this is true, what he was doing at Wounded Knee. When he said, a little proudly, that he was on a Buffalo Soldier tour, she replied, "Buffalo soldiers and the white man killed my people. My ancestors are up there, and I don't appreciate you being here. Why don't you go visit Abraham Lincoln's grave?" And then she sped off. The reporter went back to the bus looking as if he'd been hit over the head by a 2x4, and with a new appreciation for what historian Simon Schama calls the strangeness of the past. Now, unfortunately, enlightenment seems to come one person at a time, while wrong-headedness spreads by the thousands. So, we have a movie in which Buffalo soldiers surround Apaches, let them keep their weapons, have a talk by the fire, establish a rapport with their nominal enemy, and then they look the other way while they escape to the mountains. Now, this Rainbow Coalition fantasy insults all the participants. The Apaches, who were among the most astute of trackers, trailers, and scouts, would never have allowed themselves to be surrounded by a patrol of American soldiers, white or black. The Buffalo Soldiers, had they been adept enough and lucky enough to have bagged Victorio, would never have let him go. So the producers of the film, hell-bent to validate their own notion of race relations, showed the greatest disrespect for the strangeness of the past in coming up with a story that may provide consolation but does not reflect reality. Now, history is messy. It's complicated, it's ambivalent, it's paradoxical, and as confusing as can be. And we have to approach the past with respect for that strangeness if we're to understand it on its own terms. By the way, I have to say, the Glover movie is not the worst Buffalo Soldier movie ever produced. So, okay, the movie distorts the past. What's the big deal? It's a movie, right? And what are the obligations of a producer and a director? They're to entertain an audience and to make money by doing so. So why fuss about this film? Sure, it panders to current perceptions, we know that, but we're just a bunch of cranky historians. We're not film critics, we're just citizens who go to the movies. And so why do we get excited? Well, there's two reasons. First of all, people get their history from the movies all too often instead of from books these days. They don't always understand that what they're seeing may be fun, but that the content may be rubbish. Second, Turner Broadcasting intended that we take this movie seriously, so we'll do that. They published a so-called educator's guide, posted it on the World Wide Web, and encouraged teachers to use the film in the classroom. They wanted the film to be seen as history, and they wanted the film to be used as teaching. This is where the filmmaker went beyond the usual charter, entertain people, and make money. And this is why a critique of this film is legitimate and even necessary. Anyway, to sum up the Buffalo Soldier story, I want to remind you that the saga of the Buffalo Soldier is a mainstream story. Buffalo Soldiers participated in central episodes of the American experience. Like the white soldiers of their time, they fought in wars that are the stuff of movies and legends. They built infrastructure, the roads and the telegraph lines. They wrested the country from the Native Americans, and they represented a substantial portion of a huge public investment in the development of the West. They also fought in foreign wars at the turn of the century. Horace Bivens fought in Cuba. They fought in Cuba against Spain and in the Philippines against a native independence movement, 3 black sergeants from the Philippines. And they participated in Pershing's punitive expedition into Mexico. They did all this despite having to deal with the racism that was prevalent at the time. The facts of prejudice and bigotry give their story a singular quality. They regularly faced hostility, occasionally confronted violence, and served in an army that made it extremely hard for them to advance beyond non-commissioned rank. Even without the embellishment of the myth makers, their story is part of the national epic, and it should be treated as such. It's not just black history, it's American history. Now, this talk has blended a survey of that history with some modern perceptions that try to bend the past to suit some current purposes, to validate some of today's beliefs and values, to make some of us feel good about who we are. History is used for that purpose, rest assured, everywhere and at all times. We call such uses heritage sometimes, selective forays into the past to explain or support our current self-image, as opposed to history, a broad, encompassing effort to understand the past, whether it reflects well on us, poorly, or not at all. So, for example, we have the Lewis and Clark expedition of 1804-1806, whose bicentennial has just been commemorated. We don't say celebrated, of course, because it offends some Indian groups who are definitely not celebrating. President Thomas Jefferson sent these intrepid Army officers across the continent to see what they could see, with comprehensive orders to assess the fauna and flora, transportation routes, native residents, and Lewis and Clark conducted what amounted to a sweeping resource survey oriented toward commerce with the Indians and with the rest of the world via the Pacific Ocean. By the time of the centennial in 1905, in a period of territorial acquisition, booming industry, they were hailed at a huge exposition in Portland, Oregon, as representing the spirit of progress and as champions of industrial growth and resource exploitation. By the recent bicentennial, they had morphed into friends of bugs and bunnies and exemplary models of multiculturalism, traveling with an Indian woman, the intrepid Sacagawea, whose face is now on a $1 coin, even though we don't know what she looked like, and an African-American sidekick, York, who was a slave, befriending the natives along the way, prudently, since there were only 26 of them, basically a couple of culturally sensitive proto-environmentalist outdoor guys who wore buckskin instead of Gore-Tex. The whole spectrum of Western American history is full of episodes that are ripe for competing myth makers. The Alamo, March 1835 battle for Texas independence. Is it the defiant stand of freedom-loving Americans or the slavocracy's rebellion against abolitionist Mexico? What about George Custer? Was he a martyr for advancing civilization? An arrogant racist who got what he deserved? Or just an impetuous commander who underestimated his enemy? The Buffalo Soldier story, which now blends history with heritage, fact with myth, has entered the mainstream with these other iconic Western sagas, Lewis and Clark, Custer, and the Alamo. So clearly we can answer the question posed by the persuasions, will you survive in this new land, with a resounding yes. And it's now also safe to say, not only that this is not just black history, but American history, but beyond that, to conclude, it's not just American history, but it's American mythology too. Thank you. I think there's a lot to think about there when we start to examine this history, because I do think that it's important and interesting history, but I think it and its own importance is reflected in the fact that it has morphed because people have a need to try to comprehend it in terms of their way of seeing the world today. And I find that overall evolution from history to mythology one of the most fascinating topics. I hope I haven't disappointed or appalled you by concentrating on that about halfway as well as halfway on the history. But I think it's very important because I think it explains a lot about who we are as well as about who they were. Any reaction, sir? Yes?
Well, I think a lot of us have the same kind of question we're trying to figure out. We were 100 years ago when the Buffalo Soldiers came to Vermont, and can you share some of what you've learned about, who they were, when they came here, what the experience was, what they were doing here,
Yeah, they came here in 1909 and they stayed till 1913. They'd come from a tour of duty in the Philippines, and they're coming at a time when the Army was consolidating and stationed whole regiments at posts, so they came 700 strong, as Mark Spencer reminded me earlier this afternoon. And so there were a lot of them. There were a lot of black soldiers coming to a small white community. But the most important thing they did while they were here was to leave. I mean, they started a 700-mile march from here to the Shenandoah Valley for summer maneuvers with a couple of white regiments. And operationally, that was the most important thing they did. They were garrison soldiers. They kept their posts clean, they trained, and they were ready. But while they were in Vermont, they really did not operationally do anything of any significance. But demographically, they were significant because they were the kernel of a black community that started here. And Sylvia has an exhibit about that and those descendants at the library. So demographically, they were significant. Socially, they're significant because they challenged the views and expectations and outlook of a white community. So in those regards, they were significant.
But before they came, the units stationed at 40th and L were very prominent in the community, participating in parades. They were really very visible.
While they were here.
While they were here.
Yes. Yes.
And were the Buffalo Soldiers, you know, as visible? Were they?
Yes, 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 they were. I mean, that's traditional public relations between a garrison and a town. And you can bet they played baseball against town teams, and you can bet they marched in patriotic occurrences. And so there was definitely contact between them and the town. And they, of course, they were the 10th Cavalry. They did have a very interesting and significant recent past. They'd been in the Philippines twice. They'd been in Cuba. They'd fought Geronimo, and they'd fought Victorio. And some of the guys who were here brought that experience personally.
So the one rumor is that they were stationed here to punish Redfield Proctor for stationing black units down in Texas, the ones that Teddy Roosevelt had issues with.
I don't know, because I've really never studied the 10th Cavalry's experience here. I leave them a few years before that, because once they get here, they're not operationally interesting to me. And I think if you studied them carefully here, you might find that the social patterns would not have been too much different from their encounters and interaction with other communities. So you know what you're saying is very plausible. I'll go that far, and you probably know more about that than I do, but I don't know. Anyone else? Yes, please.
I was really interested in how you tied in the Buffalo Soldier history, as well as Cuba and the Spanish-American War and other things in education that I only learned about in a philosophy course at a college level. And I'm just curious about if there's other areas of history in this country and how it's taught, and just how we move with this knowledge ahead in terms of how we educate youth, or how we work to share history in the most accurate and important way, in terms of, you know, advocating for basic human rights for all people in an equal way.
I think we have to take the past on its own terms. And I think that's the basic important message. We have values that people 120 years ago would not understand. And so we're trying to teach two things, or you are. We're trying to teach a certain set of values for our daily lives today, and we're trying to teach a past at the same time. And I think it's when we impose and layer one on the other that we make a mistake. But I think it's important to know both, because I think that's what gives our values today meaning, is that, you know, we have evolved these values over time from different sets of values being challenged by different sets of circumstances. And we're not like, the past is not like the present, but older. And that's an important message to impart to students. Well, what was it like? How was it? I mean, what sense does multiculturalism and affirmative action make if we don't understand a past before that? Makes no sense at all. Where does it come from? And I think that's the way the past has to be, you know, in that context, that's the way the past has to be approached. Does that answer your question okay?
Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
Would you say then that the Buffalo Soldiers were pursuing job opportunities really, and there's no evidence that they had a sense of irony in their fighting the Native Americans?
I hesitate to say no sense of irony, but I see minuscule evidence. And one of the difficult things in cross-cultural history is that you don't have equivalent documentation, and that reflects the cultural chasm between the cultures in this case, because we do have written documentation on one side, we don't have it on the other. But that alone should make us very, very cautious about making assumptions about what one side thinks about the other, because we only have documentation on one side. And even that documentation, I mean, I used in this presentation the personal views of quite a number of soldiers who wrote them down. but they do not represent a majority of soldiers. There's a substantial body of this literature, but I don't think it has statistical validity, but it's still all we have. On the other side, we have nothing. We have nothing. We have logic, and we have the knowledge that the cultures were dramatically different, and we have knowledge of the conflict between the two. And so it's extremely risky to posit any kind of mutual understanding when we have nothing. And I'm not even willing to say that the Indians did not have respect for the Buffalo Soldiers. I'm willing to say that there is no evidence that the Indians had respect for the Buffalo Soldiers, which is different.
So there's nothing in any oral traditions about this, or?
Indian tradition, no.
In oral tradition?
There's two or three. There are some Indian writings that refer to soldiers. Black Elk, the Sioux shaman, or medicine man, I guess you might call him, talks about soldiers as Wasatchus. That's the Dakota word for soldiers. There are black Wasatchus and there are white Wasatchus, but they're all Wasatchus. And there's evidence that the Utes, when they saw the 9th Cavalry ride into battle at Milk River in 1879, taunted them for riding behind the white soldiers, so that they knew that there were differences in this culture, that, you know, the European American culture, however you want to call it, and that blacks were in a subordinate position. There's no evidence that they showed any special respect for the blacks, but they taunted them. There's evidence of that. So there is occasionally you'll find something, but not the kind of evidence that would support the claim that Indians respected the black soldier. Okay?
Question of trivia, really. Were there any Buffalo soldiers in the 7th Cavalry at Little Bighorn?
Isaiah Dorman was a scout of mixed ancestry. We're all of mixed ancestry. But he was a guy who was allegedly partly black. And he apparently was on the expedition. I don't really remember whether he managed to leave before the battle or later. But the Army was segregated. The 7th Cavalry had no black soldiers. But there was a black on the expedition. That we know.
Were the Buffalo Soldiers ever used to respond to labor issues?
Oh yeah. Oh yes indeed. They did exactly the things that white soldiers did. And one of them was protect railroad property, like in 1894.
They were at the Pullman strike?
Yeah. Well, it was the American Railroad. It was the national strike that proceeded from the Pullman strike. And in a case or two, and perhaps more that I don't know about, it is known that the defenders of property asked for black soldiers because they thought it was less likely that the soldiers and the strikers would have any mutual feeling for each other, that they'd have some sympathy. That happened in the Johnson County War in Wyoming in 1892, for example, that they called for the 9th Cavalry from Fort Robinson, Nebraska, because they characterized the small ranchers they were at war with as Texan thieves. Texan thieves, and the black soldiers, as they put it, would have no truck with each other. So yeah, they were used, and they were used in a particular way in a couple cases. Yeah, it's a good question. Ma'am?
To satisfy my curiosity, I'm totally fascinated by the fact that I live in Vermont now, and I actually know some descendants of the Buffalo Soldiers. And listening to your talk tonight, and not your great support of the movies that have been put out, with all the information that you have, and now a continued resurrection of the Buffalo Soldiers, and Mark Marley, the Whalers, singing Buffalo Soldiers, doesn't that interest you to develop some kind of screenplay or more accurate about the situation?
Nobody would go.
Sergeant Rutledge is a really good film, and I just say that as a point of information, not to answer your question, not to evade your question. What?
Don't be a politician.
No, I once tried to write a novel, and I just didn't get very far, and it's just not who I am and what I do. There was a black defector in the Philippines named David Fagan who's intrigued me for almost 40 years because he was a 19-year-old kid from Tampa who defected from the army in the Philippines, became an officer in the insurrection, led troops against the Americans, drove the Americans so nuts that Frederick Funston, who was the white hero of the war, made excuses as he ran out of ammunition in battle against Fagan. They belittled him. They put a price on his head. The New York Times called him the celebrated Fagan. Like everybody who picks up the paper should know who this guy is. So there's real stuff. There's really great grist for somebody who knows how to do a treatment, knows how to do a novel. But that's just not what I do. And I tried to do it, and it just kind of petered out. It just, that's why I'm a poor historian. I'm a good historian with not much money. So that's what I meant. That does address your question.
That was good. That was good.
Thank you. But Sergeant Rutledge is a really good film, and it's surprisingly good because it was done in 1960. And it's very sensitive about the black soldier, not sensitive about the Indian. It's a John Ford film, and it's very sensitive about the soldier, about why they're in the army, and about their unit cohesion, which of course, as I mentioned to you, they stay in the army longer than white soldiers. They tend to have families in the army, and that's partly because respectable employment on the outside is so scarce, and the army becomes a home to these guys. And John Ford's film is very good about these kind of things, and I recommend it. And it does show, you can make a good Buffalo Soldier movie. It's 50 years old. It does. Its theme song is some. My name on my website is Captain Buffalo, and Captain Buffalo is the theme song of Sergeant Rutledge, and Captain Buffalo is kind of a Paul Bunyan-esque character. He'll march all night and he'll march all day, and he'll wear out a 20-mule team along the way. It's a song they sing in a John Ford way because this is a John Ford movie, and so it does in a way have something to do with the beginning of a Buffalo Soldier myth. But it's still a fine movie, a really good movie. As a director, Danny Glover is a really good actor. Yes.
I can't speak of what it was like now. But when I was in the Navy in the 1950s, there was an awful lot of black Southerners in the Navy because they had no place at home.
Yeah.
Whereas in the Navy, they have autonomy. They can become not very many officers, but certainly senior petty officers, some officers. Yeah. And nobody was on their neck.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's right. Very shortly after the executive order desegregating the services, the executive order in 1948. When the military desegregated in 1948, of course, that's 6 years before Brown versus Board of Education, and it's one of the strongest examples of the military as a pioneer in social life, and this is a role that the military resents playing and sometimes resists playing. It complained a lot about desegregating because this was not the place for this kind of experiment. It complained a lot about women. It's now complaining about homosexuals. But one thing about the military, and I love it, I mean, I served 3 years in it, and I worked for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs for a long time. Sooner or later, they march and they salute and they bring social change. And that's a role that I don't think we often enough give them credit for, actually. If I had my druthers, Black History Month would be in May, by the way. Then I wouldn't have to worry about getting home tomorrow.
You mentioned employment as incentive for staying in for a longer time, and you also said that they suffered abuse being in the military. But would you say that prestige and actually they get more respect from being outside the military, being part of the military gave them more respect? They were treated with more respect than they were in that position?
Yes, I would say that. And when you think about the post-Civil War world, you think of the trappings of the master class in the South before the Civil War. Ride a horse, carry a rifle. I mean, these are the kinds of things that it was worth your life to try to do if you were black in that culture. And all of a sudden, after the Civil War, this is, you know, these are the basic accoutrements of a soldier. And these things are symbolically very significant, I think, in that culture. To be able to carry a weapon freely and to ride a horse. These are very significant things. Well, you guys were actually, I don't usually get this many questions, and they're not usually this penetrating, and you guys are very good, and I thank you. I thank you for your attention. And this has been a lot of fun for me, and I hope you enjoyed it.